A lot of this course is concerned with equities or stocks, and the purpose of this clip is to go through the basic definitions of what a stock actually is. A stock or equity in a firm is sometimes referred to as the residual value. In other words, the firm might have a capital structure that's composed of bonds and equities. The first claim on the firm, if the firm gets into trouble, such as bankruptcy, are the bondholders. They get paid first. Any residual value that remains is in the hands of the stockholders. And that's why stockholders are sometimes referred to as the residual claimants. So, in a way, you can think about the stockholders as only getting paid if the value of the firm exceeds what is owed to the bondholders. And the stockholders have limited liability in that the worst possible scenario for the stockholders is a value of zero. So basically, we can think of the payoffs of the firm are if the firm has a value greater than what's owed to the bondholders, the stock picks up all of that extra value. If the firm has a value equal to or less than what is owed to the bondholders, then the stock has a zero value. Now, there are two types of stock. The first type is common stock, and that's most of this course will concentrate on common stock, and there's another type called preferred stock. Preferred stock does not have all the rights of common stock. A preferred stock has a fixed dividend that very much makes it look like a bond. So the dividend is fixed, and the firm must pay that fixed dividend. If the firm is not able to pay that fixed dividend, then the preferred shares often revert into common shares. So the preferred stock is in between a common stock and a bond. The common stock has a completely discretionary dividend payment. So if the firm chooses to pay a dividend, it can, and many firms choose not to pay any dividends for years. Now, one important thing is that the common stock has voting rights. In many countries, common stock is divided into two types of common stock, a voting common stock and a non-voting common stock. In the US, almost all of the common stock is of the voting type. And this means that the common stockholders have the power to elect the board of directors and really the senior management of the firm. They really control the firm. And this makes sense in that they're going to do things that will maximize the value of the firm. So they will do things to maximize really all the stakeholders' values in the firm, because if the bondholders don't get paid, then obviously the stockholders do not get paid. And later in the course, we'll talk about some of the issues that are involved with the different stakeholders within the firm. So there's many types of stakes to the firm. The bondholders, the common stockholders, the preferred stockholders, and then we can divide up the common stockholders into voting and non-voting. But we want to focus initially on the equity holders, and I'll almost always be talking about voting equity. So the common equity that has voting rights. Now, there's many different ways to view the value of the equity of the firm, and one way I've already discussed, that if we exceed what's owed to the bondholders, then the value is simply the value of the equity. In lecture note 2, we go through a number of different models of stock valuation. And these are simple models, and the first model we look at is the so-called dividend discount model. This model originates way back to Williams and Gordon in 1962. It's a simple model, and what it does is it values the dividend stream that the stock will pay out. So in terms of what we know already about present value, it's like taking the dividends that are expected through time, discounting those back to the present value using an appropriate discount rate, and that determines the value of the stock. Now let me digress just a little bit on this. First thing, the discount rate that we use is not going to be the 90-day Treasury bill rate, because the equity is much different than a bond. The equity is much riskier. The dividend payments are not known in advance. The price of the stock could vary wildly through time. So the discount that we use for each of these cash flows is a rate that has a premium over and above the Treasury bill rate. Okay, and sometimes we refer to this as the cost of equity, or the required rate of return on equity. Now, we use the basic same intuition to value equities as we do to value bonds. We've got cash flows, and we bring those back to the present value, and that should equal the price of one share. Now, one thing that you might wonder is, well, why are we just discounting the dividends? Because people get dividends and so-called capital gains. So the dividend is the quarterly payment that is made on many securities, and that is a cash flow directly to the investor. But if the investor sells the stock after a certain period of time, a so-called capital gain might be realized. So for example, suppose that you bought the stock at $20 and it's paying a dividend of, let's say $1 per year. And suppose you hold that stock for a couple of years. At the end of 2 years, the stock is worth $30. Well, you've collected some dividends, but when you sell the stock, you actually realize a capital gain. The capital gain is simply the difference between what you sold the stock for, $30, and what you bought the stock for, $20, divided by the stock price that you bought it, $20. So the gain in this case is 50%. So there's really two components to the return on a stock. There's the dividend component, and then there's the capital gain component. Now the question is, in these simple stock valuation models, what we do is we look at only the dividends. Does this make sense? Because it seems like there's a capital gain later on. Well, it definitely does make sense, and let me tell you why. Suppose we're standing 2 years from now, and the stock price is $30. Well, what determines that $30 stock price? Well, somebody is taking the future dividends and discounting them back to the present value, which is 2 years from now, equaling $30. So really, the new price of the stock is simply representing the expected dividends in the future. So what we can do is to simply look at the dividend cash flows and discount those back to the present value. And the sort of models that we look at in the lecture notes are very simple and stylized, but actually used quite often by practitioners. So what we often do is to estimate the dividend for next year, have an estimate of the cost of equity or the discount rate, and then have some idea of what we expect the growth to be in the dividend cash flow. In a simple model, the model of Gordon 1962, sometimes known as the dividend discount model, or DDM, the value of the stock today is simply the expected dividend next year divided by the cost of equity minus the expected growth rate. And this delivers the value of the stock. So this very simple rule of thumb model is often used to see if the price of the stock is within the ballpark of where it should be. Now, I say that this model is simple and stylized because it relies upon a number of assumptions. The first assumption is that the cost of equity is fixed through time. This is not necessarily the case. The cost of equity could vary through time as the firm engages in riskier or less risky projects. Secondly, it relies upon the assumption that we know next year's dividend in advance and that the dividends grow at a constant rate through time. And casual empirical evidence would suggest that this is not the case. That dividends are fixed for long periods of times and then they jump. And they're constant and they move up again. So this is a very simplifying assumption that allows us to get the value of a stock. So the important lesson here is that this model is best viewed as a rule of thumb model. The valuation of equity is a complex task. It's an important task, and within this course we will look at a number of tools that allow us to assess whether equities are fairly valued. The dividend discount model is just one of these tools, and perhaps it's the simplest of all the tools. You should be aware that the model exists because you will see it. Practitioners of finance often use this as a benchmark model for the valuation of securities. So it's a starting point. And now let's go on with some additional details about equity valuation.